HOA Karen called 911 over free gas. Too bad I'm the city's police chief. Welcome, everyone. Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to ask one small favor. Let me know where you're watching from by leaving the name of your city or country in the comments below. I truly appreciate it. Now, without further delay, let's meet the main character of today's story. Some people think a clipboard and a neighborhood rulebook make them more powerful than the law. That morning, one phone call proved how wrong they could be. The first thing I noticed was the faint hiss coming from the city's portable propane filling station as technicians checked each connection before opening the valves. The cool fall air carried the familiar scent of fresh-cut grass, mixed with the sharp odor of propane that always lingered for a moment around the equipment. Families had already begun lining up with their approved cylinders, chatting quietly while volunteers handed out coffee and bottled water. It wasn't an emergency response. It wasn't a publicity stunt. It was a city-sponsored relief program designed to help residents whose utility bills had climbed high enough to force impossible choices between heating their homes and buying groceries. My name is Daniel Brooks, and although almost everyone in the city knew me as the chief of police, almost nobody in that neighborhood recognized me without the uniform. That was intentional. I had learned years earlier that titles changed the way people behaved, and every once in a while I preferred seeing how ordinary citizens were treated when nobody believed someone important was watching. I wore faded blue jeans, an old brown work jacket, and a baseball cap with no badge, no department logo, nothing that hinted at my actual position. I spent the first 20 minutes helping an elderly couple lift a small 20-pound propane cylinder into the inspection area, while another volunteer explained the safety guidelines. Children laughed nearby as they chased falling leaves across the sidewalk, and neighbors who had barely spoken before exchanged smiles while waiting their turn. It felt like the kind of morning every public servant hopes to see, where government quietly does something useful without asking for applause. Then I heard high heels striking the pavement with sharp, impatient clicks. The conversations around me became noticeably quieter before I even turned around. A woman in a perfectly pressed cream-colored blazer marched toward our temporary station carrying a thick binder stamped with the HOA logo, as if it were an official badge of authority. Her name, I would soon learn, was Linda Harper, president of the Homeowners Association. She stopped less than 6 feet from our equipment, looked at the propane tanks, looked at the line of grateful residents, and frowned as though she had discovered a crime scene instead of a community service event. "Who authorized this?" she demanded, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. One of the city employees politely handed her a printed permit issued by the Municipal Public Works Office along with a flyer explaining the assistance program. She barely glanced at either document before handing them back. "I don't care what the city says," she replied. "This neighborhood has HOA regulations. You cannot distribute gas here without my approval." Several residents exchanged confused looks. An older veteran quietly told her the program had been announced weeks earlier through the city's official website and local news stations, but Linda dismissed him with a wave of her hand before stepping closer to me. "And who exactly are you supposed to be?" she asked. I smiled and answered honestly. "Just someone helping the community today." She seemed almost offended by my calm tone. "Then you need to shut this operation down immediately." I looked around at the families waiting patiently, at the volunteers giving up their Saturday morning, and at the city trucks parked legally along the curb with every required permit displayed in the windshield. "Ma'am," I said as respectfully as I could, "everything here has been approved through the proper channels." That answer only made her more determined. She reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and held it high enough for everyone to see. "Fine," she announced confidently. "If none of you are willing to listen, I'll let the police explain it to you." The neighborhood fell almost completely silent as she pressed 3 familiar numbers on the screen. I watched her raise the phone to her ear while several residents quietly shook their heads, already sensing that this ordinary Saturday morning was about to become something none of them would ever forget. What Linda Harper didn't know was that the officers she had just requested were about to answer directly to me. Linda spoke loudly enough for every family in line to hear the dispatcher answering her call, making sure her voice carried across the entire entrance of the neighborhood as though she expected applause instead of questions. She described the city program as an unauthorized operation, claimed dangerous fuel was being handed out without permission, and repeatedly insisted that the homeowners association had ordered us to leave. I could hear only her side of the conversation, but from years of working with emergency communications, I recognized the careful, professional questions coming from the dispatcher. Was there a fire? No. Was anyone injured? No. Was there an explosion or an active threat? No. Linda hesitated before admitting none of those things had happened, then immediately redirected the conversation toward what she called a violation of neighborhood authority. Around me, several residents lowered their eyes with the uncomfortable expression of people who had clearly seen similar confrontations before. An elderly woman quietly whispered that this was not the first time the homeowners association had tried to interfere with city services. A father standing beside her gently shook his head and muttered that they had almost canceled a community blood drive the previous year over a disagreement about parking permits. I did not interrupt anyone. Instead, I kept helping residents move their approved propane cylinders through the inspection process exactly as we had been trained. Every cylinder was examined, every valve checked, every safety instruction repeated. The purpose of the event was never speed. It was trust. Public safety only worked when people believed the rules existed to protect them rather than intimidate them. Linda ended the call with a satisfied smile before slipping her phone back into her purse. She folded her arms confidently and looked directly at me. "They are on their way," she announced. "You still have time to shut everything down before this becomes much worse for you." I nodded politely. "Thank you for letting us know," I answered, continuing to help a retired schoolteacher secure the protective cap on her cylinder. My calm response seemed to frustrate her even more because she clearly expected panic. Instead, she found volunteers calmly checking equipment, city employees reviewing paperwork, and neighbors patiently waiting their turn. Nothing about the scene matched the emergency she had attempted to describe. One of the engineering supervisors walked over holding a clipboard filled with permits, inspection certificates, and authorization letters from the city. He quietly asked whether I wanted him to explain everything again. I smiled and told him there was no need. Every document had already been offered once. If someone refused to read them, repeating the same explanation rarely changed the outcome. A young volunteer who had never worked one of these events before leaned closer and asked whether we should stop distributing propane until the officers arrived. I appreciated his concern because he genuinely wanted to avoid conflict. "No," I told him. "We continue serving the public unless lawfully instructed otherwise. The permits remain valid, the equipment remains safe, and these families should not lose assistance because someone disagrees with the program." He nodded, visibly reassured, and returned to helping an elderly couple load their cylinder into the back of a pickup truck. As I watched them drive away with grateful smiles, I remembered why I had chosen a career in public service decades earlier. The badge on my office wall had never been about authority for its own sake. It represented responsibility, patience, and the willingness to stay calm when someone else was determined to create unnecessary conflict. That was exactly why I had decided not to wear my uniform that morning. Too often people change their behavior the instant they recognized a title. Without the uniform, I could see genuine character instead of rehearsed politeness. Linda continued pacing near the entrance while occasionally reminding nearby residents that the homeowners association would not tolerate what she called unauthorized activities. Several people quietly ignored her and remained in line, more interested in lowering their heating costs than participating in an argument. Children continued laughing near the sidewalk, volunteers continued passing out coffee, and the city technicians continued monitoring every connection with careful precision. Then, somewhere beyond the entrance of the neighborhood, I heard the distant sound of approaching patrol vehicles. The familiar hum of their engines grew steadily louder as they turned onto the main street, and judging by the timing, I knew the responding officers would arrive within moments, completely unaware that the person they had been dispatched to investigate had approved the very community program they were about to encounter. 3 patrol sport utility vehicles rolled smoothly to a stop along the curb with their emergency lights turned off, a clear sign that the dispatcher had correctly categorized the situation as a nonviolent service call rather than an active emergency. The conversations around the propane station faded almost instantly as every pair of eyes shifted toward the officers stepping out in calm, measured movements. Linda Harper straightened her blazer, lifted her chin, and walked toward them with the confidence of someone convinced the next few minutes would validate everything she had been saying. Before any officer had the chance to ask a single question, she began speaking rapidly, pointing first at the propane cylinders, then at the city trucks, and finally in my direction. She insisted that unauthorized fuel was being distributed inside a private community, claimed the homeowners association had already ordered us to leave, and argued that everyone present was refusing to obey neighborhood authority. The senior patrol sergeant listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding while making brief notes in a small notebook. Years of experience had taught him that the first version of a story was rarely the complete one. When Linda finally paused to catch her breath, the sergeant thanked her politely and asked the same question every good officer asks before drawing conclusions. "Does anyone else have information about what happened here today?" Several residents immediately raised their hands. An elderly veteran explained that the event had been announced by the city weeks earlier. A retired teacher described receiving an official flyer in her mailbox. A young mother held up the confirmation email she had received from the Municipal Assistance Office showing the scheduled distribution time and location. The engineering supervisor calmly presented a folder containing permits, inspection reports, insurance documentation, and authorization letters signed by the appropriate city departments. The sergeant accepted the folder, carefully reviewed the first few pages, and handed it to another officer for verification. Throughout the entire exchange, I remained beside the inspection table, helping another resident secure the protective valve cap on a 20-pound propane cylinder before reminding him to transport it upright in the bed of his pickup truck. Staying focused on the actual purpose of the event sent a stronger message than joining the argument ever could. Linda watched with growing frustration. She had expected panic, excuses, or hurried attempts to pack up the equipment. Instead, she found organized volunteers continuing their work under established safety procedures, while uniformed officers quietly gathered facts without taking sides. She stepped closer to the sergeant again and lowered her voice just enough to sound confidential while still allowing nearby residents to hear. "You need to remove that man immediately," she said while pointing toward me. "He admitted he is just a volunteer, but he refuses to follow the authority of this association." The sergeant glanced in my direction for only a moment before returning his attention to the documents. "We will speak with everyone involved," he replied evenly. That answer clearly disappointed her because it was not the immediate enforcement she had imagined. One of the younger officers walked slowly around the temporary distribution area, observing the orderly lines, the clearly marked safety cones, the fire extinguishers positioned beside the equipment, and the certified technicians monitoring every connection. He quietly commented to his partner that the operation appeared exceptionally well organized. Nearby, children continued drawing pictures with sidewalk chalk while their parents chatted with neighbors they had not seen in weeks. The atmosphere felt more like a community gathering than a confrontation, except for the growing tension surrounding Linda herself. She continued insisting that the homeowners association possessed the final authority over everything taking place within the neighborhood boundaries, repeating the claim often enough that several residents exchanged uncomfortable glances. I had heard similar misunderstandings many times during my career. Homeowners associations could establish and enforce certain community rules within the limits of applicable law, but they could not simply replace municipal authority or cancel lawful public programs because someone disliked them. The distinction mattered, and the responding officers understood that very well. The sergeant finally closed the permit folder, thanked the engineering supervisor, and began walking toward me with the measured pace of someone preparing to ask a few routine questions before completing his report. Linda folded her arms with quiet satisfaction, convinced the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived. She smiled at several nearby residents as though the outcome had already been decided, never realizing that within the next few seconds the entire conversation was about to change in a way she had never imagined. The patrol sergeant stopped a few feet in front of me with the same calm professionalism I had seen him demonstrate countless times during departmental briefings. He offered a polite smile before speaking. "Sir, thank you for your patience. We are gathering information from everyone involved so we can accurately document the call. Would you mind telling me your role in today's event?" Before I could answer, Linda stepped between us just enough to reclaim the conversation without physically interfering. "His role does not matter," she declared. "He admitted he is just helping. What matters is that I already told him this operation is prohibited by the homeowners association, and he ignored a lawful order. The sergeant acknowledged her comment with a slight nod, but did not allow it to interrupt the normal sequence of his investigation. Ma'am, I appreciate your statement. I still need to hear directly from him. That small decision seemed to unsettle Linda more than anything that had happened so far. She had expected the officers to accept her version immediately. Instead, they continued following policy, speaking with every witness and reviewing every document before reaching any conclusion. I finally answered. My name is Daniel Brooks. I am volunteering alongside city personnel to help oversee today's assistance program and make sure everything runs safely. Every word I spoke was truthful, although intentionally incomplete. There was no reason to introduce my title before the officers completed their initial assessment. I wanted the process to unfold naturally because good investigations relied on facts rather than assumptions about who happened to be standing nearby. The sergeant thanked me and asked several routine questions about the permits, the safety inspections, and the distribution schedule. I answered each one clearly, while the engineering supervisor provided supporting paperwork whenever necessary. Nearby, another officer quietly confirmed that the propane supplier had passed all required inspections earlier that morning. A certified technician explained the filling procedures, demonstrated the emergency shutoff system, and pointed out the fire safety equipment positioned around the work area. Everything matched the documentation already reviewed by the patrol team. Even so, Linda remained convinced she controlled the outcome. She folded her arms confidently and addressed several residents standing behind the officers. "You all heard me warn them," she said. "The association has rules. If people refuse to respect those rules, they have to face the consequences." A retired teacher gently responded that she appreciated the homeowners association maintaining landscaping and neighborhood standards, but did not understand why a city relief program should be stopped when every permit had already been approved. Linda dismissed the question without answering it directly. Instead, she insisted that neighborhood leadership always had the final word. I noticed several officers exchange brief glances, not because anyone wished to embarrass her, but because they understood the legal distinction between private association policies and municipal authority. The conversation had quietly shifted away from emotion and toward jurisdiction, documentation, and procedure. Those were subjects that rarely favored loud opinions over written evidence. One young officer approached the sergeant after checking the dispatch notes on his mobile computer. In a low voice, he explained that the original emergency call reported a potentially dangerous, unauthorized fuel operation, but the information gathered at the scene did not appear consistent with that description. The sergeant simply nodded and continued documenting the facts without expressing any conclusions. Watching the investigation progress reminded me why I had always emphasized patience during officer training. The public often imagined police work as dramatic confrontations, but the reality was usually far quieter. It involved listening carefully, comparing statements, reviewing documents, and allowing evidence to tell the story. That approach protected everyone equally, regardless of titles or personalities. Linda, however, mistook the officer's professionalism for hesitation. Believing she needed to pressure them into immediate action, she took another step forward and confidently announced, "If your department refuses to remove these people, I will personally contact the chief of police this afternoon. I know exactly how to make sure this situation receives attention." For a brief moment, the air around us became strangely still. Several officers lowered their eyes to hide faint smiles while a few residents looked from Linda to me with puzzled expressions, sensing there was something they did not yet understand. I remained completely composed, offering no reaction beyond a polite expression. There was no satisfaction in watching someone unknowingly build the very misunderstanding that would soon unravel on its own. The sergeant slowly turned toward me again, studying my face for another second as though a distant memory had just surfaced. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly from routine concentration to quiet recognition, and I realized that within the next heartbeat, the ordinary investigation Linda believed she controlled was about to take a direction that neither she nor anyone else in the neighborhood had anticipated. The patrol sergeant looked at me for another quiet second before his expression changed completely. It was not dramatic, and it was certainly not theatrical. It was simply the unmistakable look of recognition that comes from seeing someone you have worked beside for years in an unexpected place. "Excuse me," he said carefully, taking one step closer. "Sir, have we met before?" I smiled slightly. "More times than I can count, Sergeant." His eyes widened for the briefest moment before he straightened his posture almost instinctively. "Chief Brooks?" he asked in a voice that was no louder than before, but carried through the suddenly silent crowd. I gave a small nod. "Good morning, Sergeant." The change in the atmosphere was immediate, although nobody raised a voice and nobody rushed to do anything unusual. The officers simply recognized the head of their department standing in front of them dressed like an ordinary volunteer. The younger officers who had not noticed me earlier now looked again, and several of them immediately understood why my face had seemed so familiar. Linda stared from one officer to another as though she expected someone to laugh and explain that this was all a misunderstanding. Instead, she found only calm professionalism. "Chief," the sergeant continued respectfully, "I apologize. I did not realize you were here today." I shook my head. "There is nothing to apologize for. You handled the call exactly the way you should have. You listened to every witness, reviewed the permits, and gathered the facts before reaching any conclusions. That is precisely what I expect from every officer in this department." His shoulders relaxed slightly at those words, and I could see several younger officers quietly absorbing the exchange. Moments like these often became better lessons than any classroom presentation. Linda finally broke the silence. "Wait a minute," she said, looking directly at me. "You are the chief of police?" "Yes," I answered calmly. "My name is Daniel Brooks, and I have served in that position for several years." She blinked several times before forcing an uneasy smile. "Well, why did you not say that from the beginning?" I answered honestly because the question deserved an honest response. Because the law should work the same way for everyone. If the officers had treated me differently before knowing who I was, I would have been disappointed. I wanted them to investigate the complaint based on evidence instead of titles. The patrol sergeant nodded in agreement. "That is exactly what we attempted to do." Linda looked around at the surrounding residents, many of whom now seemed less surprised by my identity than by the calm way the officers had handled the situation. A retired teacher quietly smiled. The elderly veteran I had helped earlier tipped his cap in silent appreciation. Even the engineering supervisor looked relieved that the conversation had remained respectful despite the unexpected revelation. I turned back toward the officers. "Please continue your investigation exactly as you planned. My position should not influence your report in either direction. Document the facts, review every statement, and complete your work according to department policy." "Yes, Chief," the sergeant replied without hesitation. Linda appeared increasingly uncomfortable as she realized the conversation had shifted beyond personalities. Nobody was celebrating, nobody was humiliating her, and nobody was using authority to win an argument. The focus remained exactly where it should have been from the beginning. The permits, the emergency call, the jurisdiction, and the documented facts. She tried once more to regain control of the discussion. "I was only trying to protect the neighborhood," she insisted. "If I believed something dangerous was happening, I had every right to report it." "You absolutely did," I answered. "Every resident should report genuine safety concerns. Calling for assistance in good faith is an important part of keeping a community safe. That is why our department takes every call seriously. The remaining question is whether the information provided accurately reflected the situation the responding officers found upon arrival. That is something the report will determine based on evidence." Those words seemed to settle over the gathering more heavily than any accusation could have. The officers returned to reviewing documents, speaking with witnesses, and comparing the dispatch information with what they had personally observed. Linda no longer looked like someone waiting for immediate enforcement. Instead, she watched the investigation continue with growing uncertainty, finally realizing that the same professional process she had expected to work in her favor would now evaluate every statement, every document, and every decision with equal fairness, regardless of who had made the original call. The investigation continued with the same steady pace it had followed from the beginning, and that was exactly what I wanted. Once my identity was no longer a mystery, it would have been easy for everyone to assume the matter was already settled, but good public service did not work that way. Titles did not replace documentation, and assumptions never replaced evidence. I thanked the responding officers for remaining objective, then quietly stepped back beside the engineering supervisor so the patrol team could complete every remaining question without feeling rushed. The sergeant reviewed the city permits one more time, confirming the authorization numbers against the digital records available through his patrol computer. Another officer contacted the Municipal Public Works Office, which verified that the propane assistance event had been scheduled several weeks earlier and coordinated with the appropriate departments. A third officer spoke with the certified propane technicians, documenting the inspection process, the safety procedures, and the qualifications required before any cylinder could be filled. Every answer supported the paperwork already sitting inside the permit folder. Linda remained unusually quiet during this stage of the investigation. Earlier, she had confidently directed the conversation, but now she watched as every statement from every witness became part of a complete factual timeline. The dispatcher's call notes were compared with the conditions officers actually encountered upon arrival. The permits matched the city records. The equipment matched the inspection reports. The volunteer roster matched the event authorization. Even the schedule printed on the community flyers matched the information confirmed by municipal offices. One resident mentioned that several neighborhood security cameras overlooked the entrance where the conversation had first begun. Linda quickly replied that the Homeowners Association maintained those cameras to protect community property. The sergeant politely asked whether the recorded footage would be available if needed to verify the sequence of events. She hesitated for a brief moment before answering that it could be requested through the association's normal procedures. "That may be helpful," the sergeant said while making another note. Video often provides an objective timeline. The engineering supervisor then produced another document that had not yet been discussed. It was a detailed site plan showing where every safety cone, fire extinguisher, service truck, and distribution station had been positioned before the first resident arrived that morning. The officers compared the diagram with the actual setup surrounding them and found everything exactly where the approved plan indicated it should be. A young officer quietly remarked that the event appeared to be one of the most thoroughly documented community assistance programs he had ever inspected. I smiled, remembering how many planning meetings had taken place before a single propane cylinder was delivered. Programs that served the public required careful preparation because trust was earned through consistency rather than promises. Linda finally cleared her throat. "I still believe the Homeowners Association has the right to protect the neighborhood," she said more cautiously than before. "No one is questioning your right to raise concerns," I replied calmly. Communities function best when residents speak up about genuine safety issues. The important distinction is that concerns should be based on accurate information, especially when emergency resources are requested. That protects both the public and the integrity of the response system. The sergeant nodded while completing another section of his report. "Our responsibility is simply to determine what information was reported, what officers found upon arrival, and whether the documented facts support the original complaint." Nobody argued with that statement because it reflected the purpose of every professional investigation. The residents standing nearby seemed noticeably more relaxed now that the discussion centered entirely on procedures instead of personalities. Children returned to their sidewalk drawings. Volunteers resumed offering coffee to families waiting in line, and the steady sound of propane cylinders being safely inspected filled the brief pauses between conversations. The neighborhood no longer felt divided into opposing sides. Instead, it felt like a community watching its public institutions operate exactly as they were intended to operate. Before closing his notebook, the sergeant informed everyone that the completed report would include witness statements, supporting documentation, dispatch records, and any additional evidence considered relevant under department policy. Nothing would be omitted, and nothing would be added beyond what the facts supported. I thanked him for that approach because fairness depended upon complete records rather than quick conclusions. As the officers prepared to finish their on-scene investigation, I noticed several residents quietly approaching one another with stories of previous occasions when city services had encountered unexpected resistance within the neighborhood. None of those conversations had been part of the original emergency call, but together they suggested that the events of this morning might represent something much larger than a single disagreement over a lawful community assistance program. As the officers completed the final sections of their report, the atmosphere around the neighborhood entrance changed from tension to reflection. What had started as a loud disagreement was now unfolding through documents, witness statements, and verified facts rather than assumptions. Several residents who had remained silent throughout the morning slowly approached the patrol sergeant and asked whether they could provide additional statements. He assured each of them that anyone with relevant information was welcome to speak, and he carefully explained that every statement would be documented individually and evaluated on its own merit. One by one, neighbors described previous occasions when city contractors had experienced unnecessary delays after arriving to perform authorized work. One resident recalled a sidewalk repair project that had been postponed because of repeated disputes over temporary parking access. Another remembered a scheduled tree maintenance crew waiting nearly 2 hours while questions were raised about permits that had already been approved by the city. A retired firefighter quietly explained that a public safety presentation had once been relocated after volunteers encountered unexpected objections despite having written authorization from the appropriate department. None of these accounts automatically proved wrongdoing, and the officers treated them exactly as they should have, as independent witness statements requiring verification rather than immediate conclusions. That distinction mattered because fairness depended on evidence instead of emotion. Linda listened as each resident spoke, occasionally attempting to explain that the homeowners association simply wanted to maintain high standards within the neighborhood. No one argued with the importance of community standards. Clean streets, maintained landscaping, and organized neighborhoods benefited everyone. The issue was whether those goals had sometimes been pursued in ways that unintentionally interfered with lawful public services or created confusion about where association authority ended and municipal authority began. The patrol sergeant summarized the situation with admirable professionalism. Our responsibility today is limited to documenting the reported incident and forwarding all relevant information through the appropriate review process. Any broader administrative questions will be handled by the agencies responsible for those matters. That measured response reassured everyone present because it reminded the neighborhood that every institution had its own role. Police documented facts. City departments reviewed permits. Administrative offices evaluated policies. No single person decided everything in one afternoon. I thank the officers once again for remaining patient throughout the entire investigation. The public notices professionalism, I told the younger officers quietly. Sometimes they remember how respectfully you listened even more than the final outcome. They nodded with the kind of thoughtful expressions that told me the lesson would stay with them long after the paperwork had been filed. Nearby, the engineering supervisor informed me that nearly every scheduled propane cylinder had already been distributed safely. Families continued arriving at a steady pace, and volunteers welcomed each person with the same calm attitude they had shown before the first patrol vehicle ever entered the neighborhood. Looking across the line, I saw elderly couples, young parents, military veterans, teachers, nurses, and small business owners. They came from different backgrounds, but they all shared one simple goal that morning: reducing the cost of heating their homes as colder weather approached. Watching them reminded me why public service deserved careful protection from unnecessary conflict. Linda stood quietly beside the sidewalk for several moments before finally speaking again. Her voice was noticeably softer than it had been earlier. "I never intended for any of this to become so complicated," she admitted. I answered without anger because I believed people learned more from calm conversations than from public embarrassment. "Most difficult situations begin with misunderstandings," I said. "The important part is what we choose to do after the facts become clear." She looked toward the city trucks, the volunteers, and the residents leaving with their approved propane cylinders. For the first time all morning, she appeared to see the event as the community assistance program it had always been rather than as a challenge to neighborhood authority. Before the officers departed, the patrol sergeant confirmed that the completed incident report, the witness statements, the supporting permits, the dispatch records, and any available video evidence would all be forwarded through the department's standard review procedures. Nothing would be accelerated because I happened to be present, and nothing would be delayed for the same reason. That consistency was essential because public confidence depended upon equal treatment under the same rules. As the patrol vehicles prepared to leave, Several residents thanked the officers for taking the time to listen instead of rushing to judgment. Their appreciation was directed not at any individual outcome, but at the process itself. I watched the vehicles pull away knowing that the most important part of the day was no longer the emergency call. It was the complete record that now existed, built from permits, dispatch logs, witness accounts, and objective documentation, quietly ensuring that every decision made after this morning would rest on verified facts instead of assumptions. Over the next several weeks, the events of that Saturday morning quietly moved through the same administrative channels that every documented incident followed. There were no dramatic announcements and no rushed decisions. Instead, the process unfolded exactly as public accountability was designed to work. The police report was completed with witness statements attached. The dispatch recording was preserved. The responding officers submitted their observations, and the municipal departments responsible for the propane assistance program confirmed once again that every permit, inspection, and authorization had been valid before the first resident arrived. The Homeowners Association also received formal requests to provide any relevant records, including communication related to the community event and the security camera footage overlooking the entrance where the initial confrontation had taken place. I deliberately removed myself from every administrative review that did not require my participation because fairness demanded independence. My responsibility was never to influence the outcome. My responsibility was to ensure the process remained impartial. A few days later, I attended a routine interdepartmental meeting where representatives from Public Works, Emergency Management, Community Services, and the City Attorney's Office discussed ways to improve coordination for future neighborhood assistance programs. Interestingly, the conversation focused less on one individual and more on preventing similar misunderstandings from happening again. Better communication with neighborhood organizations, clearer public notices, and direct points of contact were all added to the planning recommendations. That approach reflected something I had always believed. Strong institutions did not simply react to problems. They learned from them. About 2 weeks after the incident, I received an update that the administrative review had been completed. The findings confirmed that the propane assistance event had operated within all applicable city requirements, and that the responding officers had handled the call appropriately by independently verifying the reported information before reaching any conclusions. The review also concluded that future interactions between municipal programs and neighborhood associations would benefit from additional procedural guidance, so that private community rules would not be confused with governmental authority. Those recommendations were distributed to the relevant departments and community organizations. One afternoon, while visiting another neighborhood outreach event, I unexpectedly saw Linda Harper walking toward me. She looked very different from the woman who had confidently stood beside the propane station weeks earlier. There was no binder tucked beneath her arm, no raised voice, and no determined expression. She stopped a respectful distance away before speaking. "Chief Brooks," she said quietly, "I have been thinking about everything that happened." I simply listened. "I believed I was protecting the community," she continued. "Somewhere along the way, I started treating authority as though it belonged to me instead of remembering that it comes with limits. I should have reviewed the information before assuming the city had done something wrong." I appreciated her honesty because sincere reflection often required more courage than winning an argument. "Every community benefits when people care enough to ask questions," I replied. "The challenge is making certain those questions are guided by facts instead of assumptions. Public institutions and neighborhood organizations can accomplish much more when they work together rather than against each other." She nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that now." A few weeks later, another city assistance event was scheduled in the same neighborhood. This time something remarkable happened. Representatives from the Homeowners Association volunteered to help direct traffic. Community volunteers greeted residents. City employees managed the distribution stations, and local families worked side by side throughout the morning. The atmosphere felt completely different. Instead of debating who possessed authority, everyone focused on serving the people standing in line. The elderly veteran I had met during the previous event smiled as he accepted his approved propane cylinder and joked that cooperation was much lighter to carry than unnecessary conflict. Everyone around him laughed because they knew exactly what he meant. Looking across the neighborhood that afternoon, I realized the greatest victory had never been revealing my position as chief of police. Anyone could impress people with a title for a moment. Lasting trust came from demonstrating that the law worked through patience, transparency, documentation, and equal treatment. The real success of that day was not that one misunderstanding had been resolved. It was that an entire community had discovered that respect for lawful process created stronger neighborhoods than personal pride ever could. Several months have passed since that autumn morning. Yet every time I drive through that neighborhood, I still notice the same entrance where a single telephone call unexpectedly became one of the most meaningful reminders of why public service demands patience more than pride. The temporary propane station is long gone, replaced by neatly trimmed landscaping and families walking their dogs along quiet sidewalks. But the lesson from that day has remained. The neighborhood itself feels different now. Community meetings are better attended, city representatives are invited instead of questioned, and homeowners association volunteers regularly coordinate with municipal staff before large public events take place. The change did not happen because one person won and another person lost. It happened because everyone involved eventually recognized that cooperation accomplishes far more than confrontation ever will. I occasionally receive updates from community outreach coordinators who tell me that participation in assistance programs has increased since that incident. Residents who once hesitated to attend city events now feel comfortable asking questions, reading official information, and working directly with public employees instead of relying on rumors or assumptions. Even the volunteers who stood beside me that morning still laugh whenever they remember how ordinary the day seemed before everything changed. They often tell new volunteers that professionalism is measured by how calmly people respond when circumstances become unexpectedly difficult. That is a lesson no training manual can fully teach. One afternoon, I attended the annual Community Appreciation Gathering hosted jointly by the city and several neighborhood organizations. As I walked through the park, I saw familiar faces almost everywhere. The retired teacher who had defended the assistance program was helping children at a reading table. The veteran I had first assisted with his propane cylinder was grilling hamburgers for local families while proudly wearing a volunteer apron instead of his old service cap. The engineering supervisor was explaining emergency preparedness to homeowners who genuinely wanted to learn more about utility safety. Near one of the information booths, I noticed Linda Harper speaking with a group of new residents. She smiled when she saw me and walked over with an expression that reflected confidence rather than authority. "Chief Brooks," she said warmly, "I wanted to tell you something." I listened as she explained that the Homeowners Association had recently adopted new communication guidelines encouraging board members to verify information directly with city departments before raising formal objections to municipal projects. They had also created a volunteer committee dedicated to supporting community service events instead of simply reviewing them from a distance. "It has made our neighborhood stronger," she admitted. "People trust each other more now." I congratulated her because meaningful leadership is not defined by never making mistakes. It is defined by having the humility to learn from them and the determination to improve afterward. As the afternoon continued, children played soccer across the open field while neighbors shared food, city employees answered questions, firefighters demonstrated safety equipment, and police officers spoke with families in relaxed conversations that had nothing to do with investigations or emergency calls. Looking around, I realized that this was exactly what every public servant hopes to see. Communities thrive when institutions and citizens treat one another as partners instead of opponents. Before leaving the park, I paused for a moment near the entrance and reflected on everything that had unfolded since that first confrontation. The permits had always been valid. The emergency call had always been investigated fairly. The officers had done exactly what they were trained to do. The administrative review had followed the established process. Every important outcome had been achieved not through louder voices or greater titles, but through patience, documentation, accountability, and respect for the law. My position as chief of police had never been the true turning point in the story. The real turning point came when everyone involved allowed facts to matter more than assumptions and procedure to matter more than personal pride. That is the kind of justice I have always believed in because it protects every resident equally, whether they wear a uniform, hold a neighborhood office, or simply stand in line hoping to bring home enough propane to keep their family warm. Whenever people ask me what I remember most about that day, I do not mention the surprise on anyone's face when they learned who I was. I remember the elderly couple who left smiling because they could finally afford to heat their home. I remember the officers who proved that professionalism begins with listening. I remember a community that chose cooperation over conflict after discovering that respect is far more powerful than authority alone. And every time I think back on that morning, I am reminded of one simple truth that has guided my entire career. Real authority never needs to announce itself, because genuine justice is not loud. It is patient, it is fair, and in the end, it always finds its way.